have to do video editing later to cut out all the introduction, but I think we've still got a couple of minutes left, so we'll let people trickle in.
Jeff, do you actually use Inforgs where you're at, or did you make it up for this presentation?
No, I actually, the concept is from an Italian philosopher of information named Luciano Floridi.
Okay.
And so it's more of an analytical concept than something we would directly use, but I think it's got some the word I'm looking for is like implications for what we do. At least in terms of creating some problems. I don't know that I've necessarily got solutions.
It caught my attention anyway.
So, yeah, you know, a crazy word always is great for publication, right? So, I guess we can go ahead and get started. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Jeff Johnson. I am the Assistant Director of Institutional Effectiveness and Planning at Utah Valley University. What I want to look at today is the nature of data, and especially the implications of what data is for two questions: how we represent students in our decision processes, and how we maintain and manage student privacy within those kinds of processes. A little bit of background: I come to institutional research from a background in political philosophy and the study of information technology as a social practice. So what I'm doing today is drawing on some ideas, especially in the philosophy of information, to think about what our data structures look like, and then to develop the implications for a couple of ethical questions in there. That's part of a broader project that I've got on information and social justice that I'm working on a book on that, which will be out next year on it, so I'll try and sell that. And I'll also try to sell this as part of a project that I'm trying to put together for a mini conference at the AIR meeting in Denver on critical institutional research. That is to say, institutional research viewed from sort of non-traditional perspectives, whether that be sort of the application of critical thinking to what we're doing in institutional research, so you know questions of ethics, questions of practice, and that, whether that be critical methods, so looking at institutional research from any one of the many methodological perspectives that we've seen in education and the social sciences that come after the kind of positivist or behavioralist models that we typically use when we do research, when we do scientifically oriented research in there. I don't just mean post-positivist, since that's a distinct school, but just the broad range of that. And also critical theory, in the sense of theories that take standpoints seriously, that take difference seriously, and diversity seriously. So things like feminism, critical race theory, queer theory, etc. That's the sort of broad agenda that I'm trying to pull together for this workshop. So if you're interested in participating in that in any form, whether that's doing a presentation, maybe moderating a panel, or just being there, drop me an email or catch me on Twitter, and I will be happy to include you on that as I pull together the proposal. If there's enough interest, I'll go ahead and do that as maybe a sort of half-day thing, half-day workshop kind of proposal on it. And then we'll see if it goes anywhere. So let me start today by looking at data-driven decisions. You know, we constantly talk in education about the need for data-driven decisions. Certainly, if you look at the accreditation standards that we have, even the Northwest standards, which I'm up to my eyeballs in Northwest right now. I hope there's nobody here from NWCCU. But their standards are not particularly well-defined but even they are very strong on data driving the accreditation process. They say that we must use meaningful, accessible, and verifiable data. We must use evidence-based assessment of the university's accomplishment. And then we have to take this data and use it for improvement by informing planning, decision-making, allocation of resources, and capacity. Those are all in the Northwest accreditation standards. Those of you who have the good fortune of being in something other than Northwest, I say that because they've changed their mid-cycle review standards 3 times while I'm in the middle of a mid-cycle review. We have a little bit of a beef right now on that. At any rate, those of you in other regions certainly will be able to look to your own standards and see similar kinds of things. Data really is the thing that we're supposed to be using to make decisions. And we've got this basic framework for data-driven decision making that comes from Manjanak, Honey, and Light. That's a K-12 model, but it has then extended into higher education, in which we take all of these kinds of technical information and data sorts and different types of data. We collect it, we organize it, at which point it becomes data. The data then gets analyzed, put into context, given a meaning, that becomes information. We then pull the data together into a broad viewpoint that they call knowledge, and it's that knowledge that drives decisions anytime we've got a problem to make. That's the data-driven decision model. It's the one that has been implemented in K-12 in large part because of the requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act that institutions use, that schools use this kind of a data-driven decision model. So that's what we've got when we look at this model that's supposed to be the gold standard for how we make decisions in higher education and evidence-based, data-driven kinds of models. What I want to do, though, is to unpack the idea of what the data is. Because in this, we've got sort of 2 kinds of knowledge. We've got, let me make sure that, okay. We've got context, and we've got data. And the context in these models is helpful for us. It helps us interpret the data. But the interesting thing about context is that it only exists in relation to data. Context without data is anecdote. And we all know, of course, that anecdote is not the singular of data. That kind of thinking is what we see with this. So context exists only in relation to data. So really the only things that exist in a data-driven decision process are things that we have data for or can have data for. So what I suggest that we think of a data-driven decision process is that we've got a process in which we're making a decision in a model world rather than a real world. So we've got this model world of the things that we've got data on or the things that we can put data into. And the things that exist in our decision process are only those things that exist within that model world, and we can contextualize them, but we can't create anything new. So that really places the question of what data is very much in the forefront of our minds. By the way, if you have any questions as I'm going through, feel free to stop me. I won't tell you there's no such thing as a stupid question, because I worked at Disneyland when I was in college. And what time is the 9 o'clock parade is a stupid friggin' question. Yeah. And yes, I got that. So anyway, at any rate, so that's what we're looking at, is the question of what is data. It's important because we live in this data-driven model world when we go to make data-driven decisions with that. So we can take a conventional view of data and start there. We've got a group of students over here that we know something about. We're going to enter data about them into the technical structures of a data system. our storage processes, our validation tables, our relational structures of how tables can be related to each other, our extraction processes, what we do with our queries, etc. All of those are technical structures that then represent the students in a form that we take as being more or less an objective representation of the reality of those students. That's our sort of conventional definition of data. I'm going to break that, and with it quite possibly break our entire field, but that's okay. We can all find other jobs in something, right? Yeah, it's not difficult. What I want to suggest instead is that data is actually a translation process. There's a process of building data in which we translate the real world, or whatever we might want to call the real world, because I'm kind of a post-structuralist and not entirely convinced there is a real world. But we don't need to do that here. This works perfectly fine as long as you think that the data world is somehow looking different than the real world. At any rate, so the translation process takes the reality of data and recognizes immediately there are a lot of different ways to represent that reality. We can represent, for example, gender in many different ways. We don't have to just represent male-female. At the very least, we can represent male-female unspecified, or we can represent male-female, and if you refuse to choose, it's missing data. Or we can represent male-female, and if you refuse to choose, then the application web form sends you back and forces you to choose. That's three very basic ways that don't even go beyond the gender binary. We know, of course, that Facebook a few months back decided that they were going to dispense with the gender binary altogether, and there are now 50-something different ways you can represent gender in your Facebook account on it. So there are a number of different ways that we can represent gender. In our data systems, we're going to choose one of those ways. And our technical structures are going to do that. We can think, for example, simplest way is there's a validation table. The validation table says the following values of gender will be allowed in the database, and if you try to enter another value of gender, it's going to say, no, that's not valid, it can't be put in here, you have to choose one of the valid values. So, as a result, what that does is it narrows us down to a single final data state, that is data, and then everything else, all of those other possible representations, go up here and we call them error or anecdote or something non-data. Within the data-driven world, we get data and maybe we get context with that. So there's a translation that goes on where we take, for example, the diversity of the different ways of viewing data and reduce it to a single data state. Now that's a social process, not just a technical process, because those technical structures themselves come from other kinds of social processes. We have, for example, data standards. The data standards that we use did not come from some sort of objective, purely technical decision. The data standards that we use came from the decision of a political bureaucracy, the National Center for Education Statistics, for example, or our state standards agencies. We have institutional interests that we decide this is worth knowing something about, and this is something we don't need to know something about. And of course, once we don't need to know something about something, then it ceases to exist because it's not there in the data. So my institution, for example, does not store religious data about our students. We're a public institution, and we are very keen to present ourselves as not being concerned with religious issues. That's very interesting and very problematic for an institution at which 75% of the students belong to one particular religious group, the LDS Church. So we say, we're not going to concern ourselves with the religion of our students because that's not something that is our business dealing with. So, institutional interests play into that. There are social norms that play into that. I think certainly gender is one where we can look and see all of our, I'm sure every one of our state data standards is going to be built around a gender binary that comes out of social norms. So we can look at all of those things and recognize that the technical structures are simply ways of encoding in our data systems these kinds of social practices and social structures that goes on as well. So as a result, what we get is not simply data and anecdote. We get data that represents interests, that represents norms, that is simplified. We get data, or we get excluded from that data that we consider irrelevant, that we consider deviant in the sense of not normal, and that is overly complex for us to consider. The model world in which data-driven processes operates down here is a result of this process of socially constructing the data. Okay, questions so far? We're good? I don't want to do totally as a lecture because I know. Okay. All right. Let's see. I've gone on for 15 minutes on that already, so let me just skim through a couple of examples of how these translations take place before I get to how we then translate the entities that we collect data about. So far what we've looked at is how we characterize the entities in a data system. We do these translations. We do, for example, a normalizing translation where we take something that we consider relevant and we translate it into things that exist. So the religious preference issue. We translate diverse characteristics into normalcy and deviance. So we say, you know, these things exist. These ethnic groups, for example, exist. And if you're not part of these, you're outside of the norm. And therefore, we're not going to keep data about you. We used to do that with multiracial students, for example. You had to pick one ethnic group to be part of. Now, under the IPED standards, you can pick all of the ethnic groups to be part of if you want. So that represents a change in how we've done that translation. So we have atomizing translations. That is, translations that take something that is holistic and break it down into individual parts. We represent one and only one value for a characteristic. So we can, for example, fragment fragment identities. So we have fields for religion, we have fields for ethnicity, we have fields for state of origin. So we might have someone who is religiously Jewish, who is ethnically Puerto Rican, who is from the state of New York. And we have that data about them, but that data is fragmented into different fields, and so someone who identifies as Jew-Eurekan does not exist in our data systems because that coherence can't be brought to it because we fragment the data into different fields. Nominalizing narratives is where we take something that really exists more as a narrative, as a description, and we simply give it a name and move on. So student class standing might be a good example of that. We look, we say, okay, you've got over 115 credits, therefore you're a senior. Regardless of whether we look at it and say, okay, you know, yeah, I came here, I transferred in a lot of credits for when I thought I was going to go to law school, and then I had, you know, then I dropped out, got a job as, you know, an aircraft technician, and now I'm coming back and I want to be an aerospace engineer. Well, you know, yeah, they may have the credits to be a senior, but as far as how far away from graduation they might as well be a freshman because they've got that many sequenced courses that they've got to take. We get rid of that narrative and simply take it as one thing and we say you're a senior with that. Okay, so that's atomizing translations, and finally we've got unifying translations. Translations that sort of do the opposite of atomizing. They bring ideas together. They bring conditions together. So for example, we group people. And by far the best example of that is our ethnicity standards. The standard for Asian is anyone from basically Iran and, I'm trying to think exactly how the borders run, I think it's Iran and Pakistan east. So, or is it, no, it's the western border of Pakistan. So Iran and Afghanistan, you're European, we draw a line, if you're Pakistani, you're Asian, and that wraps all the way around to Japanese, or to Japan. And the students that I talked to as part of this project have said, wow, I just really don't feel like I have a whole lot in common with all of these other people that we've got lumped in with in that. In the way that, for example, European students do, because there is a sort of coherent European identity. Instead, we create this group that may or may not reflect what the students see. We also have sort of essentializing things, where we take things that may change over time, and we say, this is definitive you. Race is a good example of that. We know that people's identification on race, especially for multi-ethnic students, does tend to vary over time. What you identify with may depend on context as much as on anything permanent. But we take and say, okay, if you change your race, it must be because what you had previously was an error rather than a change over time. Okay, so those are all the translations of the data itself. But what do we make out of the people that we're representing? In essence, what do the rows represent as opposed to what do the columns represent? And here, I think we can gain a lot by looking to the Italian philosopher Luciano Floridi. He is, among other things, Google's chief information ethicist. Yes, that does make him both suspect and something of a contradiction in terms. But Floridi looks at the world in a way that I think at least makes sense within these model data-driven worlds, and says that the world is essentially composed of what he calls Inforgs. These are interconnected informational organisms, and basically we can think of them as entities that are composed of nothing but information and relationships to other information. So when we look at a data-driven decision process, if we look at the model of what's going on, that's exactly what our students look like. Our students don't come to us as essentially whole people in a data-driven decision model. They come to us as rows of data. They come to us with various characteristics, but nothing unifying them as a human being, unifying them as individuals. So as a result, we can say, we've got the construction of the rows. We've also got the columns describing the translations. We've got a translation as well of the rows, where we translate entities in the real world into inforgs in our data process. So, and here we then start to encounter some ethical problems, some ethical challenges. What do we do with them? Well, I want to take up two of these today, and hopefully I can get through these in 10 minutes and still leave us with a decent bit of time for discussion. The first of the questions is representation. We are organizations, and when we make a decision, we're usually making a decision about policy. And that means that we're carrying out a political act. Not political in the sense of partisanship or of connected to the government, but in the sense that we're making a collective decision for a body of people. I think the most basic definition of politics we might pursue. So we're making a collective decision for a body of people. That suggests to us that we want to represent those people that we're making a decision about in our decision processes. And I think that captures the way we think. We typically want to say, look, we want to do what's best for our students. And that is an act of representing our students. So if we think about how do we go about representing our students, we can think about it from the basic approach that political science takes to representation. We've got essentially two dimensions. One is, how much are people participating directly versus how much are people being represented by others on their behalf? And then the other is that we can look, are the people that are doing the decision making, are they acting on behalf of someone else, or are they acting on their own interests? And then we set things up so that their interests will coincide with the people that they're representing. So this isn't a good people, bad people dichotomy. It's really a how do we get decisions that reflect the people that we're trying to represent. So if we take participation, we've got a direct participation kind of approach. We can have direct democracy, for example. Of course, we can also have a representative act on their behalf, and we can pick the representatives so that they look like the people we want to represent, and say, go ahead and do whatever you want, what we call descriptive representation. We can also go with that principal-agent model, in which the people we represent are principal, and then we elect representatives to act on their behalf. And there are two ways of thinking of that. We can ask, okay, should the representatives do what the represented would want them to do, or should the representatives do what's in the best interest of the represented on that? And we can use this. This is typically used to describe legislatures and bureaucracies, but it can work just as well for us. How do we think of ourselves as trying to make the best decision for the students? Well, there are a couple that we can throw out immediately. Descriptive representation is not going to work for us because we're not students. So when we think the most basic characteristic of the people we're representing is that they're students, if non-students are making the decision, if non-students are essentially the representatives, totally can't work because we don't have the right description. That one's entirely out for us as institutional researchers. We can also very quickly throw out direct participation because unless we've got a very small institution, we have way too many students to be involved in making decisions for the entire institution. I've got 33,000 students at my institution. We're not going to have everybody deliberating on one particular topic. So that leaves us, if we're representing people in a holistic sense, with these principal-agent models. And typically, we as administrators, we as institutional researchers, are going to lean toward that trustee model. Because we typically think students, they're young, they may not make quite the best choices, as the provost at Austin P did when he described his, they've got a big database advising system in place there. And he said flat out, students don't always make the right choices. Students find it difficult to make wise choices. So we're going to be wise on their behalf, so we're going to be trustees, representing our students on the whole. If we're sitting down trying to make that decision, that's what we're doing. Shift this into a data-driven decision process, though, and now we have to make the decision based on the data, which means we're making a decision not on a holistic student, but on Inforgs and the data that's created in that. That gets very problematic. We can still wipe out the descriptive representation. Yes, we're going to pick representatives that look like, say, the average Inforg. That's problematic in itself because we're going to have we're going to have to find a representative that is 52% female and 48% male. It's a little hard to do on it. But more to the point, we still can't pick a representative that is a student, and our average Inforg is going to be a student. No question about that. So we can throw that out. We can also throw out the trustee and delegate model, the principal agent models, because both of those, if you look back here, there's something that brings that student together on the whole. Whether it's best interest, whether it's a will that a representative can mimic, there's some holistic condition, some unifying condition. That's not present in the trustee and delegate, the principal agent model. There's nothing the agent can say, here is my responsibility toward the principle that I'm carrying out. The good thing is that when we make a data-driven decision model, we're typically doing so on the basis of statistics. And so, our capability for participation is limited only by our computing capacity. Because all we're doing is taking information-based organisms. And we can immediately relate those to each other. So this seems great. We can take and have direct participation because we're not bringing people together to deliberate. We're simply taking all the information, throwing it into a model. Seems great, right? Of course, you can guess where I'm going with that. The problem is in practice. In practice, we get back to that idea of data being constructed and of Inforgs being constructed, and descriptive is still out for the reasons we've already established. Here, those Inforgs aren't the real people. They're representations of the real people that we created in the process of creating data. So, instead of the students participating directly, we are participating directly by creating data about the students. And to the extent that we got that right, in the sense that there is a right to it, then, yeah, we're in great shape. To the extent that we got that wrong, to the extent, for example, that we don't want to know what the students' religious views are because that would actually require us to start thinking about that minority of students that aren't part of the dominant religious group, which does happen at some institutions, not suggesting any in particular on that, but it could happen. So we take that interest, write that out, and suddenly these Inforgs aren't looking like the students in the real world. So this means that instead of data about a real world, what we're doing is taking us and our narrative we've created about the students, in essence, or our characteristics of it, and applying it. That then leads us back to the principal-agent model. We think, okay, if we're going to represent students, then we need to represent the students as a whole, but that requires us to supply that whole. We have to take all that data and say, what would be in the best interests of students? And so, for example, Austin P has a system that says getting through quickly and graduating in 4 years is in the best interest of students. And I think, you know, the most important classes I took as an undergraduate were the ones that I took in the 5th year because I blew off a couple of classes, had to take one extra quarter, and that put me behind, so I figured, why not take a full year and do it, and got some great stuff out of it. If somebody had pushed me along to finish in 4 years so that I get better numbers in my performance-based funding, I think I would have missed out on quite a lot with that. So we can create that, or we look at that notion of interest, and we have to recognize it as a creation that we've done. So this is the first lesson of, or the first ethical quandary we've got in data-driven decision-making, which is that when we represent the students, we're actually creating a representation ourselves, rather than taking an objective representation that we can say, you know, more or less exists in reality on that. Okay, so that's like the representation issue on this. Questions? All right, so the other problem that comes up when we think about Inforgs as opposed to thinking about individual human beings becomes privacy. We've got a number of different ways of looking at privacy that exist now. The common characteristic to them is that they're all information restrictive. So we can look at consent-based models of privacy, for instance. This says that you can't acquire information about somebody without their consent via either an opt-in or an opt-out. So you look at most companies' privacy policies, for example, and the idea behind it is that you have a public privacy policy, and if you don't want them collecting their information, you can refuse to use the site based on that privacy. That then keeps you, or withdraws your consent from doing something. A number of other sites have an opt-out option. You can go into your preferences and select opt-out, and then they don't collect data on you. So, that's the consent model. There is an ownership model in which your privacy rights information about you is your property, and if somebody wants to use it, They can, with your consent, and they can even compensate you for it. And the normal way of protecting privacy then would be a market model. If they're not paying you enough to make it worth giving up your privacy, then you say no. And in the moment they offer you enough to make it worth it, then you say, yeah, go ahead. You're going to give me free email that really works, unlike Outlook. Yes, that's enough compensation to make it worth giving up my privacy and letting Google know everything about me so it can best target email advertising. More complicated notions of privacy, we have the idea of contextual integrity that Rebecca McKinnon argues on behalf of. This is the idea that if you take an initial collection of data, it's justified by a particular purpose, a particular context. If you take the data and move it into a new context, you need a new justification for it. That violation of the contextual integrity means that you've got to break down with privacy, and thus the transfer of information is unjustified. And finally, we've got the recently developed right to be forgotten, which has become a big issue with the European Court of Justice's ruling that European citizens do have a right to be forgotten, and that Google, for instance, has to destroy information about people. It has to destroy, for example, links to data on other websites. They have to exclude some people from search results, for instance, based on it. So we look there, and the common thread about all of this is that privacy means some way of excluding information from a decision process or from an information collection process. That, when we think of personal privacy, when we think of human beings, might make sense. But in a data world, there aren't human beings. There are only Inforgs. And when we take away the information, we're actually changing the Inforgs. So, for example, we take away information about Sean Regan here, and Sean Regan says we're not going to give out our phone number, and as a result, we don't know where Sean Regan is. We are also, that's the most basic kind of thing. We've changed Sean Regan. We've in fact made Sean Regan what he is in The Big Sleep. This is, by the way, all taken from The Big Sleep. We've made Sean Regan what he is in The Big Sleep, which is missing, if you've ever seen the movie or read the book. We might opt out of some sources, but not others, and as a result, we get different information. So, for example, if we go all the way back to the first time I showed this data table, you would see we have Vivian Sternwood and Terrence Regan. Well, let's say that they both opt out of data collection from the book, but not from the movie, and then we end up with their names in the movie. And then some people simply check out altogether. So we have here, let's see, who did check out with this? We have, I think this was Owen Taylor, which was the Sternwood's chauffeur. He checks out. The movie doesn't change because we don't know who killed Owen Taylor to begin with on that. I suppose we do find out in the movie. You never do find out in the book. Below that, Mona Grant, that was Eddie Marr's wife. In that she has a bit part in the movie, in one of the last scenes, but a huge part in the book. And then we check out down here, this was one of the police captains who doesn't even exist in the movie. So suddenly, people don't exist if they exercise their privacy rights. As Inforgs, privacy isn't just missing data. Privacy is, in what's probably an overly dramatic phrase, informational suicide. At least when we conceive of privacy in terms of the flow of information, or of restricting the flow of information. This means that when we make decisions based on student information and we exclude some students from privacy, we're actually excluding those students from the entire process of being considered. We're actually almost disenfranchising students because from the perspective of our data models, those students don't exist. And of course, if you have a systematic difference in who requests privacy and who doesn't, that can become especially problematic. I don't have clear solutions to these problems. Certainly, at the least, I think an awareness of these problems can allow us to think through what's going on with them and at least mitigate them to the extent that they can. But I think in the larger perspective, I want to take these problems, substitute them under a notion of information justice. That's the big project that I'm working on right now. And I think these problems do point us to a couple of things that information justice would have to do. It would have to challenge, on the one hand, it would challenge the authoritative claims of data-driven decision-making altogether. Data-driven decision-making, as we look at it from representation, or the representative point of view, is really just our construction of data-driven decision-making. So it becomes an us-driven decision-making every bit as a non-data-driven decision-making process would be. And so it would recognize that data-driven decision-making is just as much a political act as anything else. And so I think it would suggest that there would have to be a broader notion of political decision-making, by which I mean sort of an inclusive politics, not necessarily a political battling or anything like that. But we would probably want to start thinking in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of discussion of data afterwards before we put a final stamp on it and send it on and say this is the best view of the situation that we've got. So I'll end there. I think we've got, what, about 10 minutes left? So I'm happy to answer any questions or field any criticisms or duck any fruit anyone wants to throw.
I'll just throw a couple things. One is that in your introductory comments about data and some of the background contextualizations, context, there's a wonderful little book by philosopher Nick Wolterstorff called Reason Within the Bounds of Religion. And he's flipping Kant's famous book on its head. Mm-hmm. But one of the things he talks about in there is our assumptions about data. He has assumptions about data background, the ideas we have about what even constitutes data. And then we have assumptions about the data themselves. And then we have assumptions about how one rightly analyzes or interprets data. And you use the word translation, but the thing that struck me is always missing in many of these discussions is our assumptions about these things and the interpretive framework in which we approach them. And so I think you're really on the key things there when we're looking at how we understand just even what data where the reductionism of people to numbers or to data sets, there's always a reductionism going on. We tend to not notice because we're after certain metrics or whatever, we're pursuing those, but we're not recognizing that we are in the process, in a sense, of dehumanizing. And then that gets us back to the size. There's no way not to dehumanize people when you're at an institution with 33,000 students.
Exactly.
There's
Yeah.
no
So
way it's inescapable.
Right. So then what do we do with that? And I think that's the question that data justice, the stuff I'm working on, is going to be hinging on. Is, when we live in a world of we're at 6 billion still, or we hit 7 billion yet. However, yeah, exactly. However many billion people we have, there really isn't a way to have human participation on that kind of scale. In fact, there was a fantastic essay on Medium.com from Zeynep Turfeki, who does really wonderful work on social media and political involvement, in which she was dealing with that question on climate change. That climate change is one of those kinds of problems, like disasters, where people do tend to come together and work through things. When we have a major disaster, we tend not to get, chaos of the kind that Thomas Hobbes would suggest we'd have, we tend to get people coming together. Climate change is on such a scale, though. How do we do that with that? And you know, she was suggesting that social media might be able to build some kind of communities along those lines. But yeah, I think your point there that there's got to be some way of humanizing this with that on that scale is a point that's far broader than just this particular question. You said that was religion within the bounds of reason?
Reason within
or religion, that's right. That was the concept.
Walterstorff's emeritus from Idaho.
Okay, so I'm saying this so I get it on the recording. Walterstorff's reason within the bounds of religion. Okay, I'll take a look at that. Thanks. Yeah.
This is one of the things that, as I've been working in institutional research, I think it means sometimes we need to get out of our statistical, technical side of what we do and go back to some of our other ways of getting information, such as open-ended questions on our surveys, or focus groups, or actually going out and meeting the students and not being, and especially when you brought up the religion. When I worked at the University of Denver, we did a climate survey, and we were on our NISI, our peer groups were skewing towards religious institutions. They were like us, they had quarters, they were private, they were, and so we were really low on what we were providing to our students religiously, not surprisingly.
Right.
So at some point you have to go back to the students and say, we were also, even though a public institution, not a religious institution. And so the administration didn't focus on religious things, but at some point you have to somehow gather some information from students. Is it okay for us to ignore religion?
Right.
And so there's, we have to sometimes get out of some of those technical blinders that we put on. And so I really enjoyed thinking through this. And I don't have any of the answers for what we do for that either, but it's very, it's something we do have to think about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, that maybe moving beyond just our standard statistical analyses into analyses that do take advantage of narrative structures, like focus groups, and that might actually work very, very well for us. So, in that sense, we might, certainly it segues beautifully into the panel that we'll be doing next on the, what's the title of that panel? Do you remember off the top of your head? No. But the panel on measurement and mission with religious institutions.
Secular versus.
Yeah. So that. But it also suggests that maybe that critical institutional research that I started off talking about might actually be part of the solution on data justice and information justice, which I hadn't considered with that. But you might have, I think, a really important insight there in thinking that part of the ways of doing it is marrying data-driven and non-data-driven, more narrative kinds of approaches. So, thank you.
And just sort of this, in context, is that I think when students recognize that they are being treated as a number, so when you have a sort of bureaucratic institutional necessity because of the numbers involved, so they push back by fudging on the numbers or playing with the data themselves. They mess with the system because they don't want to be treated as a number. But on the scale we're talking about sometimes, how do you get down and get to meet each student and talk with them? I mean, that's
even
not
there
possible.
you're getting representation.
Right, you're getting representation, but then you're also not going to be able to translate that easily into measurable data that helps the institution make a data-driven decision. So you really have a problem.
But that's part of what we have to communicate back to students too, is that if you opt out of things, then you are giving the power to the students who do opt in and who do answer things to define your experience at the institution.
Yeah. Whereas if you opt in, then you're giving power to the people who can use the data
Right.
on that. And I think that's
It's a conundrum.
even more than the idea that that opting out is a transfer of power to somebody. I like the idea that however you opt is a decision about where you're going to allocate power.
It's back to the marketing of the data.
Mm-hmm.
So is it worth it to me as a student to opt in or opt out?
Mm-hmm.
It's a decision that I have to make, whether it's worth it to me or not to be represented, whether I vote in an election or I opt in or out of the data company.
Yeah. And perhaps, you mentioned elections, and maybe that's the thing we have to accept, is that much like in politics, we recognize that our choice is not, are we going to give power to Congress or are we going to hold it ourselves? It's just, who are we going to give power to within Congress? Maybe that's the way we need to frame this, that there is an inevitable ceding of power, and we need to simply set it up so that students can make a reasonable decision about where they're going to cede that power to, and that we can make a good claim that they should give us the power that they might give up as institutional researchers, because we're going to use it for good things for them on that, we can make it worth it.
And if we could, my institution would need to do a better job. If we could give examples of how we've not taken advantage of that power, but actually used it for good in the past, and I think that would help us with the pushback. I get more pushback from faculty than students when we're trying to do things like that. Some of them just tell the students to say anything because it doesn't make any difference.
Mm-hmm.
But if we could show that we are forces for good and not evil, then I think that could help us balance some of these things.
Yeah.
I don't have fantastic solutions for that yet either. But.
Right. But no, I think these suggestions do sort of move us in the direction of how we might solve this. I've got 10:35 right now, so I think that's the end of our slot discussion. Thank you all so much for